Welcome to Kosovo Dispatch, a podcast dedicated to current affairs in Kosovo and the Western Balkans. I'm your host, Visar Xhambazi, and today we will be talking about the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. The EU-facilitated dialogue has been going on for 12 years, and although it has had some relative progress, it has failed to resolve all open-ended issues between Kosovo and Serbia and achieve full normalization of relations. In February and March 2023, Kosovo and Serbia verbally endorsed a second agreement along with its annex, aiming to normalize relations. However, the implementation process encountered setbacks. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić breached the agreement, while Kosovo Prime Minister Albin Kurti didn't proceed with the implementation of the Association of Serb Majority Municipalities. Given the challenges at hand, it raises this question. Is it time to consider a revised format in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, and could convening an international conference serve as a viable solution? In exploring this matter, I will be talking with Milos Pavkovic, a researcher and civil society activist affiliated with the European Policy Center based in Belgrade, Serbia. He has done extensive research on the Western Balkans with a special emphasis on Kosovo-Serbia relations. Hi, Milos. Thank you for being the first guest of the Kosovo Dispatch podcast.
And I'm glad to be your first guest.
Let me begin with the first question. Despite the enormous political capital and energy invested by the European Union, its member states, and the United States, the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue finds itself trapped in a cycle. How would you assess the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue in 2023? What went wrong, according to you?
We had a very good start, very good starting point, a very good basis for continuation of the process of normalization and for the dialogue. However, I think that for both sides, and in Belgrade and Pristina, for both governments, this agreement was perceived as a kind of forced solution or a kind of imposed solution. And that was the main reason why behind the tactic of non-implementation on both sides. This year was characterized by too many and constant tensions throughout the year, which was not good because the EU had a lot of job in fighting these tensions and trying to de-escalate the situation. So basically, the European Union was at the same time an architect of the peace process and normalization process, and acting as a firefighter and trying to extinguish the fires that were starting within the dialogue. And that made the whole process very well, how to say it? This was led by unilateral moves by both sides, and they clearly put the whole dialogue in danger. And I will be direct. I'm talking about organizing local elections in the north that were boycotted by Serbs. It also raised increased interethnic violence between Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo. And finally, it culminated in September with the Banjska incident, when we had clear clashes between the Kosovo police and Kosovo special forces and the paramilitary groups that were at that time in the north of Kosovo. So this basically involved all actors and put the whole dialogue on the brink of almost caused a bigger conflict that would involve Serbia, NATO, and other countries. So these are the this would be like a short overview of 2023 and things that went wrong. So basically everything that could, it went wrong this year. And that's why, despite we had a good start, many unilateral actions caused the problems, and basically the whole year went in extinguishing fires that were created, but not in implementing the agreement that was reached in the beginning of the year.
Well, despite the enormous political capital and energy invested by the European Union and the United States. You just mentioned all these problems, all these challenges that follow after the agreement in Ohrid was signed and its annex. Despite all this energy, despite all this investment, do you still believe that the EU-facilitated dialogue still have a chance to succeed?
It's still yes. Then my answer is yes, that it has a chance. Not only because of the fact that the EU and US have put a lot on effort, a lot of effort in this dialogue. I'll remind all our viewers and listeners that the dialogue is ongoing since 2011, so more than a decade. And the European Union has put its credibility at stake, and they wanted to position themselves as an important geopolitical player and in resolving complex situations and maintaining peace and producing peace solutions. What makes me think that this dialogue must and will be successful is what is an alternative. And I think that the alternative is not good. We've seen what's happening currently with Israel and Palestine, and this is the alternative. I think this is the alternative that no one wants, neither the European Union, neither the US, but also neither the Serbia and Kosovo and people living here. And I think this is the main for the dialogue, because we don't have an alternative to dialogue except military conflict, which no one wants, which can cost us a lot, and that's why I believe that that there is a future in this dialogue. However, I admit that we have to admit that actually there are too many challenges in the dialogue.
I agree that there's no alternative to dialogue, but what about alternatives within the dialogue? Should the European Union and the United States explore other options and formats? What is your take on the possibility of organizing an international conference where both parties, Kosovo and Serbia, would be pushed to engage in intense diplomatic meetings to find a final resolution? What would that format look like, according to you?
And an interesting topic to talk about. 2012, we had only technical meetings between the two delegations. 2012, it was changed, so the high political meetings were introduced, and since then we've been having rounds of both in parallel technical and high political meetings between presidents and prime ministers, and on the other hand, chief negotiators. This is something that that is possible actually, because as I said, we've seen that the platform can be changed, and the idea of organizing international conference was actually introduced by Albanian Prime Minister this summer, Edi Rama. It was supported by President of the European Council, Charles Michel, and it started gaining influence also among experts and among politicians. People were talking about it, especially due to the fact that we had this year, especially multiple rounds of negotiations on high political level that were unsuccessful. We had them previously, but the thing is that we are having for more than 10 years rounds of dialogue on high political level within this platform, and with each year we have more and more unsuccessful rounds. This is an indicator that something needs to be changed, because it's clearly not functioning as it should be, and maybe some introducing some refreshments in the dialogue can actually be positive, can have positive effect. Also in Serbia, it was supported by one of the opposition politicians, Nebojša Zelenović. However, it didn't gain too much influence because, as I mentioned, these tensions happen from day to day and from month to month, so nobody was actually discussing the idea of the international conference too seriously and to the currently standing. I would say that organizing international conference within the dialogue or in some other format is not likely as things are standing. because I don't think there is a political will to organize something. Prime Minister of Kosovo, Kurti, refuted this idea of organizing international conference. But I also think that that organization of such an event, or the conference would be perceived within the European Union as kind of their failure to deliver on the dialogue, and this would be impacted their credibility. That's why I think that they are not ready to accept this format of the dialogue. But maybe future will be different. This is only as things how I see things standing at this moment.
Yes, maybe in the short term, no parties are willing to consider new formats. But what if this becomes this idea starts circulating again in the medium or long term? So, do you think maybe we should also explore this idea in terms of pros and cons? So I'd like to ask you, what are the most important advantages of organizing an international conference in the context of Kosovo and Serbia dialogue?
With the conference, one of the main ideas, I think, when it was presented to the public, because when the dialogue was stalled, we had no progress. We had too many tensions in the ground. The idea of the conference is to finish the process at once. We've seen that the implementation from year to year was lower and lower of previously agreed of previous agreements, and the idea of the conference was to put table and let's discuss everything and let's finish the whole process all at once. This was the main idea, instead of having a decades and decades long process, because we're already having it now. It's more than a decade. The argument was, okay, this was long enough. Now we need to sit down and finish this process, and this is one of the advantage, because we avoid in this case we would avoid a decades long dialogue and potential, and a lot of potential for escalation. On the other hand, it would also require a multilateral approach. So involving the most important countries, especially the Queen countries. So talking about not only the European Union, but United States, Italy, Germany, France, Great Britain, and they will be their role would be much bigger compared to the current dialogue that is basically under the External Action Service and special representative for the dialogue. With they are the key drivers behind the process. Also, some other advantages would be that in this case there will be increased pressure on both sides. What we had with previous agreements, that some articles are implemented by one side, some others are not, or what happened with the Ohrid agreement, and when one side said, no, we don't want to sign this, we agree, but we don't want to sign. This organizing international conference would facilitate overcoming these kinds of problems that we've encountered so far. Also, what is important advantage of this format would be that it might incorporate a mechanism required for ratification and full application of the final agreement reached, that would be transcribed in the domestic law of both countries. Again, would overcome the issue of non-signing, not ratifying, raising questions whether the agreement is obligatory or not obligatory, etc. Because this was, I would say, the main problem in the dialogue so far. Every solution has its advantages and disadvantages, so I think it's very important to talk about disadvantages as well. And when talking about disadvantages, there are huge adverse effects, adverse reactions, both in public and in political system, because it as an international conference can incite sense of too big of a pressure and creating a feeling of injustice and take it or leave it offer that one side can see as a too great of an injustice that they will never come in peace with this agreement, with agreement that would come from the international conference. Another disadvantage is that I think that when talking about organizing international conference, both sides are only thinking in terms of maximizing their demands. And I think that both countries would think about it as like, okay, we are starting from zero, from nil, and let's now talk everything from the beginning, which again would affect the EU's credibility. And again, going back on this argument, why the European Union would not like to participate and would not support organizing international conference. And important disadvantage of organizing international conference is that there still is a possibility that it can fail. It can fail, it can finish without any success. And we had the example of United Nations led negotiations in 2005 and 2006 that failed, which then would put us in a very difficult situation, both Serbia and Kosovo and people living there, because what is next? What if the conference fails, international conference fails? What is the step after that? What can we expect? New format of the dialogue after one has already failed, or rise of tensions, or maybe some kind of a conflict. So this important question to pose before thinking about organizing an international conference. It can also, I believe that failing to reach dialogue, failing to reach agreement within the conference can trigger serious repercussions and sanctions by the Western community for both countries, and it can, it can put them in jeopardy their economic development, their future membership in the European Union, etc. So I think that the cost is too high, but the potential for failure is also considerable. That's why that's why I think that the international conference hasn't gained too much support for now.
I understand. Milos, you've listed the most important pros and cons regarding this idea. So, in your view, taking into consideration both sides of the argument, do you think it is a realistic idea in the mid or long term?
On developments within the dialogue and on the developments in the normalization process. We've seen that there is some kind of progress in the dialogue, that there is a statute that everyone is statute on the community of Serbian municipalities that everyone is talking about. If we see formation of community of Serbian municipalities, then maybe we can see implementation of all other articles of the Ohrid agreement. However, if what may also happen if we see further delays of implementation, not only association but all other obligations within the dialogue, and changes that might occur within the European Union but also in the US next year, then with some political changes we can I can see change in the format. I mean, if there is a political will, we can see also change in political format. So it's very ungrateful to predict, whether there will be or will not be international conference. In the short term, I don't think so. So in next 6 months to a year, no. But after elections in European Union, parliamentary elections for the European Parliament and US presidential elections, everything is possible. I mean, if you get some new politicians, new political elites that are willing to go this way, I think that this will be possible in a mid to long run, especially if the process of the normalization does not provide any tangible results in the future. This will be a clear indicator that the change in the format of the dialogue is necessary. But I still believe that it will stay within the auspices of the European Union, that the European Union will insist on that, but it will be only a change of the format, not international conference that we are used to, that United Nations are involved, or some countries outside the Western community. This is my prediction.
Milos Pavkovic, thank you so much for joining the podcast and for sharing your insights on this matter.